The massive Siberian tiger emerged from the snow-covered forest like a ghost made flesh, his orange and black striped body cutting through the white landscape with terrifying grace. Margaret stood perfectly still, her weathered hand gripping the walking cane that had traveled halfway across the world with her. The tiger's amber eyes locked onto hers, and for 3 heartbeats the world held its breath. Then he charged. 260 pounds of pure predator racing across the frozen ground directly toward an 82-year-old woman who had escaped a nursing home to keep a promise made 24 years ago. The rangers behind her screamed warnings, their weapons raised, but Margaret did not move. She simply lifted her cane in front of her body, exactly as she had done so many times before, and whispered a single word into the Siberian wind. Frost. Armed men surrounded her now, their faces tight with fear and anger. The tiger was close enough that Margaret could see the star-shaped marking on his forehead, the same distinctive pattern she had traced with her fingers when he was small enough to fit in her lap. Every instinct of self-preservation told those watching to shoot, to protect, to prevent the inevitable mauling that seemed seconds away. But something in the old woman's posture, in the way she held that worn wooden cane, made them hesitate, and in that hesitation, the impossible happened. If stories like this touch your heart, please consider subscribing to Wild Heart Stories. Every subscription helps us share more incredible tales of the extraordinary bonds that exist between humans and animals. These connections remind us that love and loyalty can transcend even the wildest barriers nature creates. Join our community of animal lovers who believe in the power of these remarkable relationships. 3 months earlier, Margaret sat in her narrow bed at Greenfield Nursing Home in London, the flickering television casting blue shadows across her wrinkled face. It was 11:30 at night, long after the other residents had surrendered to sleep and medication. Margaret rarely slept well anymore. Her body ached from decades of standing in field hospitals during the war, her mind crowded with memories both beautiful and painful. She kept the television on low volume, letting documentaries about faraway places fill the silence that had become her constant companion since her husband died 7 years ago. The nature program showed snow-covered landscapes, vast forests of Siberia stretching endlessly beneath grey winter skies. Margaret's hand paused on the blanket as the camera panned across a frozen meadow. Then she saw him. A fully grown Siberian tiger moved through the frame with magnificent power, his orange coat brilliant against the white snow. The camera zoomed in on his face, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. There, between his eyes, was a marking in the shape of a star. Not approximate, not similar. Exactly the same distinctive pattern she had memorized during 6 months of her life that now felt like a fever dream. Tears began flowing down her cheeks before she could process what she was seeing. Her hand reached toward the television screen as if she could touch him through the glass and distance and years. The narrator was saying something about conservation efforts in Russia, about protected reserves and population recovery, but Margaret heard none of it. She saw only Frost, alive and free and magnificent in a way she had only been able to imagine during the long years since their separation. "I promised," she whispered to the empty room. "I promised I would come back." The next morning, Margaret's hands shook as she dialed her granddaughter's number. Jennifer answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. It was Saturday morning, and Margaret knew her granddaughter usually slept late after her long work weeks at the advertising firm. But this could not wait. Some things were more urgent than sleep or convenience or the careful routines that governed life in a nursing home. "Jennifer, darling, I need your help with something rather important," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite the urgency burning in her chest. Jennifer made a sound somewhere between a yawn and a sigh. "Gran, is everything all right? It is barely 7 in the morning." "I need to go to Russia," Margaret said simply. There was no point in easing into it. To Siberia specifically, there is a tiger reserve there, and I need to visit as soon as possible. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the connection had been lost. Then Jennifer spoke, her tone carefully gentle in the way people use when they think someone is losing their grip on reality. "Gran, you are in a care home. You cannot just go to Russia. And why would you want to go to Siberia, of all places? It is freezing there this time of year. Because I made a promise 24 years ago, and I saw him on television last night, and I am running out of time to keep my word," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "I know this sounds mad, Jennifer, but I am not confused. I am not having delusions. I spent 6 months in Russia when I was 58 years old, volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation center. I cared for a Siberian tiger cub who was dying of pneumonia. I saved his life, and he saved something in me. When he was released into the wild, I promised him I would come back to see him free. And now I know where he is, and I need to go before it is too late." Jennifer arrived at the nursing home 2 hours later, her face pinched with worry and skepticism. She had clearly expected to find her grandmother in the midst of some kind of mental health crisis, perhaps needing reassurance or medication adjustment. Instead, she found Margaret sitting fully dressed at the small table in her room, surrounded by papers and photographs that had been pulled from boxes stored at the back of her closet. "Sit down, love," Margaret said gently. "Let me show you something." She spread the photographs across the table, images of a younger Margaret in practical work clothes, holding a tiny orange and black striped cub against her chest. Pictures of a rehabilitation facility with Russian lettering on the buildings. Official documents with stamps and signatures, volunteer certificates, entry visas to Russia dated 24 years earlier. And one photograph that made Jennifer's breath catch. A close-up of the tiger cub's face, clearly showing a distinctive star-shaped marking on his forehead. "This is Frost," Margaret said softly, touching the photograph with one finger. "He was dying when I arrived at the center, pneumonia and malnutrition. The staff there were overwhelmed, understaffed. They had given up on him, but I had spent 3 years as a battlefield nurse during the war, and I had learned that sometimes what looks like aggression is actually fear and pain. So I stayed with him, slept next to his pen, kept him warm when he shivered, fed him with a bottle every 2 hours, and slowly he began to trust me." Jennifer picked up one of the photographs, studying it closely. In the image, the cub was tucked into the pocket of Margaret's heavy coat, just his small face visible, eyes closed in sleep. "This is really you?" she asked, though the evidence was undeniable. "For 6 months I volunteered there," Margaret continued. "My husband had passed away the year before, and our children were grown and busy with their own lives. I felt hollowed out, Jennifer, like I was just going through motions, waiting to die. Then I read an advertisement for volunteers at wildlife rehabilitation centers, and something in me woke up. I spent 6 months in Russia. It was the coldest, hardest, most alive I have felt since the war ended. And Frost, he was the reason. He needed me, and I needed to be needed." "What happened after 6 months?" Jennifer asked, her skepticism beginning to crack around the edges. "I had to come home," Margaret said simply. "My visa expired. The center could not extend it. On the day I left, Frost was 8 months old and ready to be released into the protected reserve. I held him one last time, as much as you can hold a growing tiger, and I made him a promise. I told him that someday when he was free and living wild like he was meant to, I would come back to see him. I would see him not in a cage, but in the forest, where he belonged. It was a silly promise, perhaps. He was an animal, after all. But I meant it with everything I had." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of one photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "And you think you saw him last night?" after all this time. "I know I did," Margaret said firmly. "That marking on his forehead, it is unique. Like a fingerprint, the documentary showed the same reserve where he was released. The narrator mentioned they track individual tigers through camera traps and distinctive markings. It is him, Jennifer, and I am running out of time." "You are 82, Gran," Jennifer said gently. "Siberia in winter is dangerous. The trip alone would be exhausting. And even if you got there, what makes you think they would let you near a wild tiger?" "I do not expect them to let me near him," Margaret said, though her hand unconsciously touched the walking cane leaning against her chair, the same cane she had used all those years ago to keep the playful cub from chewing her shoes. "I just need to see him, to know that he is alive and free, to keep my promise, even if he has no memory of me. I need to do this before I die, Jennifer. It is the one thing I left unfinished." Jennifer looked at her grandmother, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. She saw not the frail, elderly woman who needed help with medications and walking, but someone who had survived war and loss and decades of quiet endurance. Someone who had once been brave enough to travel alone to Russia to save dying animals. Someone who was asking now, not for permission, but for help, with one final act of courage. "You are serious about this," Jennifer said, not quite a question. "Deadly serious," Margaret replied. Jennifer was silent for a long time. Then she did something that surprised both of them. She laughed. Not mockingly, but with a kind of desperate recognition. "You know what, Gran? My life is a disaster anyway. I'm getting divorced. My boss hates me. I've not felt genuinely excited about anything in months, maybe years. So why not? Let us go to Siberia. Let us go find your tiger." The escape from Greenfield nursing home proved easier than expected, primarily because no one believed an 82-year-old woman would actually attempt it. Margaret signed herself out against medical advice, a right she retained despite living in care, and the staff could do nothing but watch disapprovingly as Jennifer helped her grandmother into a taxi with 2 packed suitcases and 1 very old, very worn walking cane. The administrative director, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, followed them to the door. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is extremely ill-advised. The winter weather, the travel, your medications, your age." "I am aware of my age, thank you," Margaret said crisply. "I was aware of it this morning when I woke up, and I suspect I shall be reminded of it frequently during this journey. But I am also aware that I have lived through a world war, raised 3 children, buried a husband, and survived 82 years on this planet. I think I can manage a trip to Russia." Mrs. Patterson turned to Jennifer with an expression of appeal. "Surely you can talk sense into her. This is dangerous, reckless. Have you ever tried to talk my grandmother out of something once she's made up her mind?" Jennifer asked, with a slight smile. "No? Then consider yourself fortunate. Trust me, it is less exhausting to just help her do it safely." The nursing home's other residents gathered at the windows to watch the departure. Dorothy, Margaret's closest friend among the residents, stood at the glass with tears streaming down her face. Margaret blew her a kiss through the window, and Dorothy pressed her hand against the glass in response. They both knew this might be the last time they saw each other. Dorothy was 90 years old and frail. Margaret was embarking on a journey that might kill her. But some promises mattered more than safety. The journey was exactly as exhausting as everyone had predicted. 3 flights, 2 layovers, customs inspections, language barriers, and finally a bone-rattling 4-hour drive in a hired vehicle with a Russian driver who spoke no English and drove like death was chasing them. Jennifer held her grandmother's hand through most of it, watching her face for signs of distress or regret. But Margaret sat straight in her seat, eyes bright, looking out at the snowy landscape with an expression of fierce determination that made her look decades younger. They arrived at the reserve headquarters just as the sun was setting on the second day of travel. The building was low and practical, built from wood and stone, with smoke rising from a chimney. Lights glowed in the windows, warm and welcoming against the darkening sky. Margaret climbed out of the vehicle slowly, her joints protesting after hours of sitting, and stood looking at the vast forest that stretched beyond the buildings. Somewhere out there, in all that cold and snow and wilderness, Frost was alive. The door of the main building opened, and 3 men stepped out. 2 were young rangers in official uniforms, their faces confused and wary at the sight of elderly woman and her granddaughter arriving unannounced. The 3rd man was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He wore a heavy coat marked with the reserve's insignia and carried himself with unmistakable authority. He spoke in accented but clear English. "I am Victor Petrov, director of this reserve. We do not have visitors scheduled. This is restricted area. How did you even find this location?" Margaret stepped forward, using her cane for balance on the icy ground. "My name is Margaret Whitmore. 24 years ago, I volunteered at the rehabilitation center in the south. I helped save a tiger cub with pneumonia. He was released into this reserve when he was 8 months old. 3 days ago, I saw him in a documentary on television, the marking on his forehead shaped like a star. It is unique. His name is Frost, and I promised him I would come back." Victor's expression shifted from annoyed to astonished. You are the British nurse? From the rehabilitation program?" He turned to one of the young rangers and spoke rapidly in Russian. The ranger pulled out a radio and spoke into it urgently. "I cannot believe you are here," Victor said, turning back to Margaret. "We have your name in the files. You saved 3 tigers during your time there, including the cub you call Frost. But ma'am, with respect, you cannot be here. This is not a zoo. These are wild tigers in protected territory. It is dangerous, illegal for unauthorized persons to be in the reserve. I will have to arrange transport to escort you back to the airport." Margaret's fingers tightened on her cane. She had traveled 4,000 miles, exhausted her body, terrified her family, and abandoned the safety of her nursing home. She was not leaving without at least trying. "I know he is wild," she said quietly. "I do not expect to touch him or interact with him. I just need to see him, to know that he is free and alive. Please, I am 82 years old. I do not have many chances left." Victor looked at the old woman standing in the snow, at the fierce determination in her eyes, at the walking cane that looked as old and worn as she did. He opened his mouth to refuse, to explain regulations and liability and common sense. But before he could speak, a sound cut through the cold air. From somewhere in the darkening forest came a roar, deep and powerful, the voice of a predator calling across his territory. Margaret's head turned sharply toward the sound, and Victor saw her face transform with recognition and longing so profound it was almost painful to witness. "That is him," Margaret whispered. "That is Frost." Victor's expression hardened. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your attachment, but there are many tigers in this reserve. You cannot possibly identify one individual by sound alone. This is not safe or reasonable. I'm sorry, but I must insist you leave. I will arrange a vehicle to take you back to the city first thing in the morning. Tonight, you can stay in our guest quarters, but tomorrow you must go." Jennifer stepped forward, putting a protective arm around her grandmother's shoulders. "Please, she came so far. Can she not just see him once, from a distance, safely?" "And how do you propose we do that?" Victor asked, not unkindly but firmly. "Walk an 82-year-old woman into the forest in winter, in the dark, hoping to spot one specific tiger among many? It is impossible. It is dangerous. I cannot allow it. I am sorry." Margaret said nothing. She simply stood in the snow, looking out at the forest where, somewhere beyond her sight, Frost lived free. She had known this might happen, that the journey might be for nothing, that promises made to wild animals could not be kept the same way promises made to people were. But she had needed to try. And now, standing on the edge of the wilderness that held the one creature who had helped her feel alive again after so much loss, she felt the weight of all her 82 years pressing down on her tired shoulders. "Come inside," Victor said more gently. "You must be exhausted. We will talk more in the morning." But as they turned toward the building, as Margaret took her first defeated step toward shelter and away from the forest, none of them noticed the single set of massive paw prints in the snow just beyond the tree line. Fresh prints made within the last hour, leading directly toward the place where the old woman stood. The guest quarters were small but comfortable, with 2 narrow beds, a wood-burning stove, and windows that looked out onto the forest. Jennifer helped her grandmother settle in, unpacking medications and arranging pillows. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her coat, staring out at the darkness beyond the glass. She could not see anything in the blackness, but she knew he was out there. Frost, alive, free, so close and yet completely unreachable. "Gran, you should rest," Jennifer said softly. "You have been traveling for nearly 2 days. Your body needs sleep." "My body has been sleeping for years," Margaret replied, without taking her eyes from the window. "I came here to wake up, just for a little while, before the end." Jennifer sat down beside her grandmother, taking her hand. "Tell me about him, about Frost. Tell me what it was really like." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice carrying them both back across 24 years to a time when she had been 58 years old and drowning in grief. Her husband's death had hollowed her out, left her going through the motions of living without feeling truly alive. Her children worried but did not understand. How could they? They were young, busy with careers and families and futures. They could not comprehend the peculiar loneliness of being old and no longer needed, of having spent a lifetime caring for others and suddenly finding that care no longer required. The advertisement had appeared in a magazine at her doctor's office. Wildlife rehabilitation volunteers needed in Russia. No special qualifications required, just willingness to work hard in difficult conditions. Most people would have turned the page. Margaret, in a moment of desperate impulse, had written down the contact information. 3 months later, she found herself on a plane to Moscow, then a smaller plane to a city she could not pronounce, then a truck to a rehabilitation center deep in the forest. The facility was basic, underfunded, struggling. They rehabilitated injured and orphaned wildlife, preparing them for eventual release. The staff were dedicated but overwhelmed. When Margaret arrived, they put her to work immediately. Feed this bear cub, clean that enclosure, help restrain this wolf for medical treatment. She worked harder than she had in decades, and for the first time since her husband's death, she fell asleep at night too exhausted to lie awake, mourning. Frost arrived at the center in March, at the tail end of a brutal winter. He was approximately 3 months old, orphaned after his mother was killed by poachers. By the time rangers found him, he was near death from pneumonia and starvation. The center's veterinarian did what he could, administering antibiotics and fluids, but the cub was failing. He would not eat, would not respond to attempts to handle him. When anyone approached, he growled and tried to bite, despite barely having strength to lift his head. After 3 days, the staff began discussing euthanasia as the most humane option. Margaret had been cleaning the bear enclosure when she overheard the conversation. She walked over to where the veterinarian stood outside the tiger cub's pen, looking down at the small orange and black form that lay unmoving in the corner. "May I try something?" Margaret asked. The veterinarian shrugged, defeated. "He will bite you." "I have been bitten before," Margaret said calmly. She had been a battlefield nurse in her youth. She had stitched wounds while bombs fell overhead. She had held dying men's hands while they called for their mothers. A sick tiger cub did not frighten her. She entered the pen alone, moving slowly, making herself small and unthreatening. The cub raised his head and hissed, but the sound was weak. Margaret could see the pneumonia in his labored breathing, could hear the rattle in his tiny chest. She sat down on the floor of the pen, not approaching him, just being present. And she began to talk, not in words that meant anything specific, just a low, continuous murmur of sound, the tone she had used with frightened soldiers, with her own children when they had nightmares, a sound that said, "You are not alone, and you are safe, and I am here." She stayed in the pen for 6 hours that first day, did not try to touch him, did not force interaction, just sat and talked in that low, soothing voice. When evening came and she finally left, the cub was watching her with amber eyes that showed more awareness than they had earlier. The next day, she brought food into the pen. Not just the meat the staff had been offering, but warm broth made from chicken, easy on a sick stomach. She set it near the cub, but not too close, then retreated to her usual spot. The cub ignored it for 2 hours. Then slowly he crawled forward and lapped at the broth. It was not much, a few swallows, but it was something. By the 4th day, the cub allowed Margaret to sit closer. By the 7th day, he let her touch him, her hand gentle on his fevered head. She could feel his body burning with infection, his breathing still labored and painful. The antibiotics were helping, but slowly. Too slowly. He was losing weight he could not afford to lose. On the 9th night, Margaret made a decision. She carried her sleeping bag into the pen and bedded down next to the cub. He was too weak to protest. She pulled him carefully against her body, sharing her warmth, letting him feel her steady heartbeat and breathing. She had read somewhere that sick children recovered faster with physical contact, with the presence of someone who cared. She suspected the same might be true for tiger cubs. The staff thought she was mad, but they did not stop her. She spent 3 nights sleeping in that pen, the cub tucked against her like an oversized cat. On the 3rd morning, he ate solid food for the first time. On the 5th day, he stood up and took a few shaky steps. By the 2nd week, he was strong enough to be properly annoying, chewing on Margaret's shoes and batting at her hands when she was not paying attention to him. That was when the walking cane became necessary. A tiger cub, even a young one, has sharp teeth and strong jaws. Margaret's shoes were expensive, and she had no desire to replace them every few days, so she began carrying an old wooden cane the center's director had left in a corner, using it to gently push Frost away when he got too mouthy. It became a game between them. He would try to grab the cane, and she would lift it just out of reach. He would pounce, and she would redirect him. It was training disguised as play, teaching him boundaries while still allowing him to be the wild creature he was meant to become. As Frost grew stronger, his personality emerged. He was curious about everything, fearless in a way that regularly gave Margaret heart attacks. He had a particular fascination with her coat, especially the deep pockets. He would nose into them looking for treats, or simply burrow his face inside when he wanted comfort. Margaret got into the habit of keeping the pockets full of things that smelled like her, bits of fabric from her clothes, so Frost could have something familiar when she had to leave the pen. The star-shaped marking on his forehead became more distinct as he grew. At first, it had been barely visible, just a slightly different pattern in his stripes. But by the time he was 5 months old, it was unmistakable. A nearly perfect 5-pointed star, dark against the orange of his fur, right between his eyes. Margaret used to trace it with her finger, and Frost would close his eyes and lean into her touch, purring so loudly she could feel the vibration through her whole body. By 8 months old, Frost weighed nearly 90 pounds and was too large to stay at the rehabilitation center. The decision was made to release him into the protected reserve, where he would have space to grow and learn to hunt while still being monitored by rangers. The night before his release, Margaret slept in his pen one final time. He was enormous now, his head as large as hers, his paws already the size of dinner plates, but he still curled against her like he had when he was dying, his massive head resting on her shoulder, breathing steady and peaceful. "You are going to be magnificent," she whispered to him in the darkness. "You are going to run through forests and catch your own food and father cubs of your own someday. You are going to live the life you were meant for. And I promise, Frost, when you are free and wild and truly home, I will come back. I will see you one more time, not in a cage, not sick or scared, but free, I promise." It was a promise made in love and hope, and the certain knowledge that it might be impossible to keep. But Margaret had learned in her long life that some promises were worth making, even when keeping them seemed unlikely. Because the making of the promise itself meant something. It meant you cared enough to try. "Gran?" Jennifer's voice pulled Margaret back to the present. "You are crying." Margaret touched her face and was surprised to find it wet with tears. "Sorry, love. I was just remembering." "Do you really think he could remember you after all this time?" "I do not know," Margaret admitted, "but I remember him, and sometimes that has to be enough." Morning came too quickly. Margaret woke to find sunlight streaming through the window and Viktor Petrov sitting at the small table in their room, drinking tea from a metal cup. Jennifer was already awake, dressed, watching the exchange with wary eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Viktor said. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Margaret replied, sitting up slowly. Her body ached from travel and sleeping in an unfamiliar bed, but her mind was clear. "Have you come to escort us to the vehicle?" "Actually, I came to ask you more about Frost," Viktor said. He pulled out a tablet and turned it to show Margaret the screen. "We maintain detailed records of all tigers in the reserve. If you can describe the marking you remember, I can verify whether the tiger you saw on television is indeed the one you knew." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She took the tablet and studied the images Viktor had pulled up. 3 different adult male tigers, all with markings on their foreheads, but none quite right. "May I see others?" Viktor swiped through several more images. Then Margaret's hand shot out, stopping him. "That one! Show me that one closer." He enlarged the photograph, a massive adult male tiger, photographed by camera trap, staring directly at the lens. His eyes were amber and intelligent, and between them, as clear as the day Margaret had last traced it with her finger, was a 5-pointed star. "That is him," she whispered. "That is Frost." Viktor studied the image, then looked at Margaret with new respect. "This tiger is designated T17 in our records. Male, approximately 24 years old, which is extremely old for a wild Siberian tiger. He controls a territory of nearly 300 square kilometers in the northern section of the reserve. He is known to our rangers as a ghost. Very difficult to track, very intelligent. And yes, he was originally from the rehabilitation program you volunteered with." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. He was real. He was here. Her promise had not been made to a ghost or a memory. "May I see him?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Viktor set down his teacup, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Whitmore, you must understand, this is not a zoo. T17 is a wild predator. We cannot arrange viewing sessions. The reserve is restricted territory. It would be incredibly dangerous, especially for someone of your age. I am sorry, but the answer must be no." "I understand dangerous," Margaret said quietly. "I was a nurse in a war zone when I was 20 years old. I've delivered babies during air raids and amputated limbs with inadequate anesthesia. I cared for a dying tiger cub that everyone said would bite me. I have buried a husband and lived through more than 8 decades of a world that is often cruel and always uncertain. I know dangerous, and I am asking anyway. Before Victor could respond, the door burst open. One of the young rangers from the night before rushed in, speaking rapidly in Russian. Victor's face darkened. He stood quickly, already moving toward the door, then paused and turned back to Margaret and Jennifer. There is a situation. Poachers have been detected in the northern sector. We must respond immediately. The northern sector? Margaret asked. Is that where Frost's territory is? Victor hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but we have protocols for this. We will handle it. He left quickly, shouting orders to his staff. Jennifer looked at her grandmother. Gran, maybe this is a sign. It is too dangerous. We should just go home. But Margaret was already pulling on her coat. Poachers killed his mother, Jennifer. That is how he ended up dying in that rehabilitation center. I will not let it happen again. Not if I can help prevent it. She walked out of the guest quarters before Jennifer could stop her. Outside, the rangers were gearing up, checking weapons, studying maps spread across the hood of a truck. Victor looked up in surprise as Margaret approached. Mrs. Whitmore, please stay inside. I can help, Margaret said firmly. With respect, ma'am, you are 82 years old. This is not a situation where... I tracked supply lines through enemy territory during wartime, Margaret interrupted. I know how to move quietly. I know how to watch and observe. I know how to think tactically. And I know these forests better than you might think. I studied maps of this reserve for 6 months when I was here before. I'm not asking to carry a weapon or confront poachers. I'm offering another set of eyes, someone who can spot things, help keep watch. I'm already here, and I'm already involved. Let me be useful. The young ranger named Dmitri shook his head. This is insane. She will slow us down, get herself killed. But the older ranger, Alexei, stepped forward. I remember a story, he said slowly, about an elephant in Kenya. She had been rescued and released by a veterinarian. 15 years later, the veterinarian returned to the reserve. The elephant recognized her from hundreds of meters away, came directly to her, remembered everything. That is a nice story, Dmitri said impatiently, but this is a tiger, a predator, not an elephant. Animals remember love, Alexei said quietly, sometimes better than people do. Victor looked at Margaret for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would change everything. You can come, but you stay in the vehicle. You do not leave our sight. You follow every instruction immediately. Agreed? Agreed, Margaret said. They drove north for an hour, the vehicle bouncing over rough forest roads covered in snow. Margaret sat in the back, watching the landscape roll past. This was Frost's territory. These were the forests he roamed. She felt closer to him with every mile, even though she could not see him. Jennifer had insisted on coming too, unable to let her grandmother go alone into potential danger. Now she sat beside Margaret, gripping the door handle as the vehicle lurched through particularly rough patches. They stopped at a monitoring station deep in the forest. Rangers unpacked equipment, checked GPS coordinates, spoke in low, urgent voices. The poachers had been spotted approximately 6 kilometers north on the edge of the reserve boundary. There were at least 3 of them, possibly more. They had already set illegal snares and were likely hunting for tigers or bears or anything large enough to be profitable on the black market. As the team prepared to move out on foot, Alexei approached Margaret. We found fresh tracks near here. Very large tiger, male, probably T17. He is close. Margaret's breath caught. How close? Within a kilometer, maybe less. He is hunting, but if the poachers are where we think they are, he might encounter them. Then we need to move faster, Margaret said. That evening, after a tense day of tracking that found evidence of poachers, but not the poachers themselves, the team returned to headquarters exhausted and frustrated. The poachers had vanished, likely warned off by the ranger presence. The The snares had been removed, but the threat remained. They would be back. They always came back. Margaret could barely keep her eyes open through dinner. The day had been physically exhausting in ways her aging body was not prepared for. But she had been useful. She had spotted a trap that others had walked past. She had noticed unusual markings on trees that suggested surveillance points. Victor had thanked her grudgingly, admitting that her experience had been valuable, but he still insisted she leave in the morning. It was too dangerous, too unpredictable. She had to go. Jennifer helped Margaret back to their quarters as darkness fell.
Gran, you did what you could. You helped protect the reserve. Maybe that is enough.
It is not enough, Margaret said softly. I need to see him, even once, even from far away. I need him to know I kept my promise. She fell asleep quickly, exhausted, her dreams full of snow and tigers and promises made in the darkness. But sometime in the deepest part of the night, something woke her. A sound, perhaps, or simply instinct honed by a lifetime of waking when needed. She opened her eyes and looked toward the window. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside, she saw them, paw prints, massive, fresh, leading right up to the side of the building, leading to the window of the room where she slept. A tiger had been there, had stood there, perhaps only minutes ago. Margaret sat up slowly, careful not to wake Jennifer. She reached for her coat, pulling it on quietly. Her walking cane leaned against the wall. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. The same cane that had traveled with her from London. The same cane that 24 years ago had kept a playful cub from ruining her shoes. She opened the door and stepped out into the frozen night. The cold bit at her face immediately, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were fixed on the tracks in the snow, leading away from the building toward the tree line. She began to walk, following them. One step, then another. Her breath came out in white clouds. Her cane left marks in the snow beside the massive paw prints. Behind her she heard Jennifer's voice, distant and panicked. "Gran! Gran! No!" But Margaret did not stop, could not stop. Because somewhere ahead in that forest, Frost was waiting. She could feel it with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason. He had come to her, and now she was going to him. Finally, after 24 years, to keep a promise made in love and hope, and the unshakable belief that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance, or the wildness of nature itself. The forest at dawn was a cathedral of blue shadows and golden light. Margaret walked slowly through snow that came up past her ankles, her breath creating white clouds that hung in the frigid air. Behind her, she could hear shouting. Jennifer's voice, desperate and terrified. Victor's voice, commanding and urgent. The sounds of rangers mobilizing, running, trying to reach her before something terrible happened. But Margaret did not turn back. She kept her eyes forward, following the massive paw prints that led deeper into the trees. The walking cane in her hand felt heavier than it should, weighted with memory and promise. This piece of wood had been with her through so much. It had kept a playful tiger cub from destroying her belongings. It had supported her through the years of aging that followed. It had traveled across continents and through airports and customs, a simple thing that carried enormous meaning. And now it was here, in the place where it had always been meant to return. The trees opened into a small clearing, a natural meadow where snow lay pristine and undisturbed except for one set of tracks leading straight across. Margaret stopped at the edge of the clearing, standing in the last of the tree line's shadow, and that was when she saw him. He emerged from the opposite side like a ghost given form, massive beyond anything her memories had prepared her for. An adult male Siberian tiger in his prime, or perhaps slightly past it, his coat brilliant orange against the white snow, black stripes creating patterns of shadow and fire. He was easily 400 pounds heavier than the last time she had seen him, his shoulders thick with muscle, his head enormous and regal. But between his eyes, unmistakable even from 30 meters away, was the star-shaped marking she had traced with her finger when he fit in her lap. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The world held its breath. Then Frost's head turned fully toward her, his amber eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made Margaret's heart stutter. She saw him go completely still in the way predators do when they have spotted prey. Every muscle in his body gathered. His eyes never left her face. And then he charged. It was not a casual walk or curious approach. It was a full predator's run, massive paws throwing up snow with each bound, body low and powerful, covering ground with terrifying speed. Behind Margaret, someone screamed. She heard the distinctive sound of weapons being readied, Victor's voice shouting in Russian, Jennifer crying, all of it distant and unimportant compared to the sight of 260 pounds of apex predator racing directly toward her with single-minded focus. Margaret did not run, did not scream, did not even flinch. She simply planted her cane in the snow in front of her body, holding it horizontally at waist height, exactly as she had done countless times 24 years ago when an over-enthusiastic cub came bounding toward her with teeth and claws and no sense of appropriate boundaries. And she spoke, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "Frost, I came back, like I promised." The tiger did not slow. If anything, he accelerated. 20 meters became 15, became 10. Margaret could see individual whiskers on his face now, could see the way his ears were pushed forward in focused attention, could count his teeth as his mouth opened. Behind her, she was dimly aware of Victor grabbing Jennifer and pulling her back, of rangers spreading out with weapons raised, of everyone preparing for the inevitable. 5 meters, 3. Then Frost hit the brakes. His massive body dug into the snow, front paws plowing furrows in the pristine white as he skidded to a stop, barely 2 meters from where Margaret stood. Snow sprayed everywhere, dusting her coat, her hair, her face. The cane remained steady in her hands. Her arms did not shake, her eyes stayed locked on his. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the old woman and the wild tiger. 24 years of life and loss and survival separated them, but something deeper connected them. Frost's nostrils flared, taking in her scent. His head tilted slightly to the side in a gesture so familiar that Margaret felt tears begin to slide down her cold cheeks. That same head tilt, that same curious intelligence, just packaged in a body that could kill her with one blow of his paw. Then Frost did something that made every ranger behind Margaret freeze in confusion and wonder. He opened his mouth, leaned forward, and gently, almost delicately, closed his teeth around the end of Margaret's walking cane, not biting down hard, not trying to take it or break it, just holding it like a dog retrieving a stick, like a cub who had played this exact game hundreds of times before. Margaret felt something break open in her chest. Joy so profound it was almost painful flooded through her. "You remember," she whispered. "Oh, my good boy, you remember." Frost pulled on the cane, not roughly but insistently. Margaret let him guide her, her feet sliding through the snow as he backed up toward a large flat stone that rose out of the ground near the center of the clearing. When they reached it, he released the cane and waited, looking at her expectantly. Margaret understood. She lowered herself carefully onto the stone, her old knees protesting, her cane supporting her weight. And the moment she was seated, Frost moved forward and lay down beside her. He pressed his enormous body against her legs, his weight substantial and warm, even through her thick coat and pants. His head came to rest on the stone beside her hip, those amber eyes looking up at her face with an expression that was unmistakably contentment. And from deep in his chest came a sound that made Margaret laugh through her tears. A purr. Not quite the same as a house cat, lower and more resonant, but undeniably a purr. The same sound he had made as a cub when she scratched behind his ears. Margaret's hand, shaking now with emotion rather than fear, reached out and touched the top of his head. Her fingers found the star-shaped marking and traced it gently. Frost's eyes closed, his purr growing louder. Behind them, Margaret could hear approaching footsteps, then stopping. She glanced back to see Victor, Alexei, Dmitri, Jennifer, and 3 other rangers standing at the edge of the clearing, weapons lowered, faces showing expressions ranging from shock to awe to disbelief. "I told you," Margaret said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I promised him I would come back, and he remembered. He remembered everything." Victor walked forward slowly, his steps careful and measured. He stopped several meters away, not wanting to disturb the tiger or create a threat. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is impossible. Tigers do not remember individual humans after so many years. They are solitary predators. They do not form bonds like this." "Then, perhaps someone should inform him of that," Margaret said dryly, her hand still stroking Frost's head. "Because I do not think he received the message." Jennifer had her phone out, recording video, tears streaming down her face. "Gran, I cannot believe this. I cannot believe any of this is real." But it was real as the cold air and the snow and the warmth of the tiger pressed against Margaret's legs, as real as the promise made 2 decades ago and kept today, as real as love, which Margaret had learned long ago was the most real thing in the world, even when logic said it should not exist. They stayed like that for nearly 10 minutes, no one wanting to break the moment. Then Frost shifted slightly, and Margaret felt something wet against her hand. She looked down and saw blood, fresh blood staining the white fur of his shoulder. "He is hurt," she said sharply. "Victor, he has been injured." The mood changed instantly. Victor moved closer, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Frost watched him, but did not move from his position against Margaret. His trust in her apparently extended to tolerating others approaching while she was present. Victor knelt in the snow a safe distance away and pulled out binoculars, examining the injury without getting close enough to threaten the tiger. "Bullet graze," Victor said grimly. "Not deep, but infected. This is from several days ago. The poachers we were tracking, he must have encountered them." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Can your veterinarian come here? Can we treat it?" "We would have to tranquilize him," Victor said, "which means drugs, stress, risk, and even then, a wild tiger." "I can treat it," Margaret interrupted. "I have treated worse than this with less equipment in the middle of a war zone. If you bring me supplies, I can clean and dress the wound, but you must let me do it. Without drugs, without stress. Let me help him." Dmitri shook his head violently. "This is insane. Even if the tiger tolerates you sitting next to him, treating a painful wound is completely different. He will attack. He will kill her." But Alexei was already speaking into his radio, requesting medical supplies. "I have seen enough today to believe in things I would have said were impossible this morning. If she says she can do it, I believe her." Victor looked at Margaret for a long moment, then he nodded. "We bring the supplies, but the moment he shows aggression, we tranquilize him. I will not let you die for this." "Agreed," Margaret said, though she did not believe Frost would hurt her. She could feel his trust, his recognition, his bone-deep certainty that she was safe. It radiated from him like heat. It took 30 minutes for the supplies to arrive via snowmobile. A full veterinary field kit, antibiotics, bandages, disinfectant, everything Margaret might need. She laid it all out on the stone beside her, while Frost watched with curious eyes. The other rangers had backed away, giving her space, weapons ready but lowered. Jennifer stood behind Victor, her phone still recording, documenting every moment of this impossible scene. "All right, my darling," Margaret said softly to Frost. This is going to hurt a bit. But you trust me, do you not? You remember that I helped you before. I am going to help you again." She began with gentle strokes along his head and neck, the same way she had calmed him when he was sick with pneumonia all those years ago. Her voice never stopped, a continuous murmur of reassurance and love. Slowly, carefully, she moved her hand down to his shoulder near the wound. Frost tensed slightly but did not pull away. His eyes remained fixed on her face, trusting. Margaret cleaned her hands with disinfectant, then began to examine the wound. It was indeed a bullet graze, perhaps 3 inches long, cutting through fur and skin, but not deep enough to damage muscle significantly. But infection had set in, the edges red and swollen. It needed proper cleaning and antibiotics. "This might sting, sweet boy," she warned. She poured disinfectant directly onto the wound. Frost's entire body went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Behind them, safeties clicked off weapons. But Margaret simply placed her other hand firmly on his head, her fingers finding that familiar star marking, and kept talking. I know it hurts, but it is helping. You are such a good boy, such a brave boy, just like you were when you were small. Remember? You were so brave then too." The growl faded. Frost relaxed incrementally. Margaret worked quickly but thoroughly, cleaning the wound, applying antibiotic ointment, covering it with a waterproof dressing that would stay in place even in snow. Her hands were steady despite her age, guided by decades of nursing experience and by love for this creature who had once needed her so desperately and now needed her again. When she finished, she pressed a kiss to the top of his head, right on the star marking. "There, all done. You were perfect. Now you need to let this heal. No fighting for a few weeks. Can you promise me that?" Frost responded by pressing his head more firmly against her hand and resuming that deep, resonant purr. Margaret laughed, the sound bright and young despite her 82 years. "I will take that as a yes." They stayed in the clearing until the sun was fully up and the day had grown as warm as Siberian winter allowed. The rangers took turns keeping watch, while others documented the encounter, taking photographs and video that would later be studied by wildlife behaviorists around the world. But mostly, they just watched. Because what they were witnessing was more than scientific curiosity. It was proof of something that people often forgot in the modern world. That love and loyalty and memory could transcend the supposed boundaries between species. That promises made in kindness could be kept even across decades and continents. That the bonds formed in moments of vulnerability and trust could last a lifetime. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Frost stood. He stretched, the movement powerful and feline and utterly wild. Then he touched his nose to Margaret's hand one final time and turned to walk back into the forest. But he stopped at the tree line and looked back, his amber eyes meeting hers one last time. A goodbye, or perhaps a see you again soon. "I am not leaving," Margaret called after him. "Do you hear me? I kept my promise. Now I am staying, for as long as I can." Frost's tail flicked once, and then he was gone, melting into the forest like smoke. That evening, back at headquarters, Victor called Margaret and Jennifer into his office. He poured tea from a samovar, his movements slow and thoughtful. "What happened today should not have been possible," he said finally. "But it happened anyway, and it has made me think about something. This reserve exists to protect tigers like T-17. But perhaps protection is not just about keeping poachers away. Perhaps it is also about honoring the bonds these animals form, even when those bonds are with humans." Margaret waited, hope beginning to flutter in her chest. "We have funding for a new observation station in the northern sector," Victor continued, "near T-17's territory. It would be used for research, for monitoring, for educating people about tiger conservation. It would need a cabin for researchers to stay in, a place with heat and running water and windows that look out onto the forest. A place where someone could live for extended periods if they chose to. Someone who might have special knowledge about a particular tiger's behavior. Margaret's eyes widened. "Victor, are you saying—" "I am saying that if you wanted to stay, we could make arrangements. Not permanently, your health would not allow that. But seasonally, perhaps you could spend winters here when the weather is harshest and the tigers are most active. You could act as a consultant for our research program. And if T-17 chose to spend time near this observation station, well, that would simply be his choice as a wild animal. We could not control where he decides to roam." Jennifer laughed, the sound bright with joy and relief. "Gran, he's saying you can stay. You can be near Frost." "I know what he is saying, darling," Margaret replied, her own voice thick with emotion, "and I am saying yes, yes to all of it." The observation station was completed by late December. It was small but well built, with thick insulation, a wood-burning stove, and large windows facing the forest. Margaret moved in with Jennifer's help, bringing her few possessions, her medications, and her walking cane. Jennifer stayed for 2 weeks, helping her grandmother settle in, making sure she knew how to contact the main headquarters if she needed help. But mostly, she watched in wonder as her grandmother came alive in a way Jennifer had never seen before. Frost appeared the first evening Margaret was alone. She saw him through the window, a massive shadow moving through the twilight. He did not come close at first, just circled the cabin at a distance, marking territory, making sure she was there. But by the 3rd night, he was sleeping outside her door. And by the end of the first week, he was lying just beyond the porch, while Margaret sat in a chair wrapped in blankets, knitting and watching him patrol his domain. They fell into a routine. Margaret would rise early, make tea, and open the cabin door. More often than not, Frost would be there, waiting. Sometimes he would stay near the cabin all day. Sometimes he would disappear for days at a time, hunting or patrolling or doing whatever wild tigers do. But he always came back, always checked on her, always lay down near enough that she could see him, close enough that she knew she was not alone. Margaret spent 3 winters at the observation station before her health finally began to fail in ways that could not be ignored. She was 85 by then, and her body was wearing out. But those 3 winters were the happiest of her long life. She documented Frost's behavior, took notes for the reserve's research, and helped train a new generation of rangers in how to read tiger signs and understand their patterns. She became something of a legend, the British grandmother who had crossed the world to keep a promise to a tiger, and ended up teaching everyone what was possible when love refused to accept boundaries. On her last evening at the station before returning to England, Margaret sat outside, wrapped in her heaviest coat, watching Frost pace through the snow. He was slowing down too. 27 years old now, ancient for a wild Siberian tiger. His movements were still powerful but less fluid than before. They were both reaching the end of their stories. But what a story it had been. Frost walked up onto the porch, something he rarely did. He approached Margaret directly and pressed his massive head against her knee. She scratched behind his ears, right in the spot that had always made him purr. "Thank you," she whispered to him. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for letting me keep my promise. Thank you for being exactly who you were meant to be." He stayed there for an hour, his weight solid and warm against her legs, his purr a constant vibration she could feel through her whole body. And when he finally stood to leave, he did something he had never done before. He licked her hand, once, a deliberate gesture of affection from a wild predator to a human who had saved his life and then returned years later to see him free. Margaret returned to England, but not to the nursing home. Jennifer had quit her advertising job and become a wildlife photographer and documentarian, using her savings to buy a small cottage in Devon where her grandmother could live out her remaining time with windows overlooking green fields and hills that rolled to the horizon. The cottage was filled with photographs, Frost as a cub, Frost as an adult, Frost sleeping outside the observation station cabin, Frost and Margaret sitting together in the snow, the most impossible friendship the world had ever witnessed. Margaret lived to be 87 years old. When she died peacefully in her sleep one spring morning, her hand was resting on a photograph of a tiger with a star-shaped marking on his forehead. And thousands of miles away, in a forest in Siberia, rangers reported that T-17 had been found lying peacefully in a meadow near the observation station, as if waiting for someone who would never come again. He died 3 days later, having lived longer than any wild Siberian tiger on record. They were buried on the same day, though continents apart. And people who believe in such things said that somewhere, in whatever place creatures go when their stories end, an old woman and a great tiger walked together through forests that never ended, keeping each other company the way they were always meant to, without cages or glass or barriers of any kind. Just two souls who had recognized each other across the boundaries of species and time and impossible circumstance, proving that some promises, when made with love and kept with courage, can change the world.